Hello, Connecting Point. Welcome back. We are in the middle of a little series using the book of Isaiah to introduce us to the way that the prophets work. And this week I want to look at the first big power encounter and message that Isaiah directs to a specific king of Judah, who is this fellow King Ahaz. You can read all about King Ahaz in 2 Kings 16 and in 2 Chronicles 28. They both give a bit of a different set of details, being written by different people at different points in the history of the Hebrews. The broad strokes of the story remain the same. So instead of beating you up with one of those accounts, I'm going to give you a kind of the Tyler Friesen summary of the story of King Ahaz. So Ahaz is a king of Judah, which is in the south, and he comes to power right near the end of the northern tribes' separate existence from the southern tribes. Remember, under King Solomon's son Rehoboam, Israel in the north and Judah in the south had split off. So Ahaz is in charge of the south. And we're right towards the end of Israel's existence, because in the east, a growing imperial power has emerged, Assyria. So what is happening in Ahaz's lifetime? It's actually happening in his father's lifetime, Jotham, who was a good king of Judah. During Jotham's lifetime, the kings of Israel and of Aram, which was the kingdom that's built around Damascus, it's kind of modern-day Syria, they too had decided to start to raid down south into Judah. And so when Ahaz comes to the throne, he's under threat from these two kingdoms. Now Israel and Aram and Judah are all roughly like equivalent. They're all about the same size. So Ahaz is facing this situation where he's got these two kingdoms that are about the same size picking on him and trying to pick him and his kingdom apart. So Ahaz makes a call he writes a letter over to the king of Assyria, this guy named Tiglath-Pileser. And he says to the king of Assyria, I will be your servant and your son. Please march and save me from the grasp of the kings of Aram and of Israel who are going against me. And Ahaz also goes and digs up a bribe to send to the Assyrians, including a bunch of the temple treasures, some of the silver and gold from the temple of the Lord, and sends them to Assyria as a bribe. So, having been paid off now, the king of Assyria marches in, wipes out the king of Aram, and takes over Damascus and hits Israel pretty good as well. It's within about 25 years that Israel is wiped out by the Assyrian invasions of this first event. So Ahaz goes up to Damascus to meet with the king of Assyria and basically do homage to him. When he gets there, he sees the altar and the kind of the religious constructions that the Assyrians are using to worship their gods. So Ahaz writes home to the priest, the Levite priest of Judah, this guy named Uriah, and says, you need to make an altar according to these plans that I'm attaching, like that I'm sending with my messenger. And so Uriah, when he receives these instructions from the king, goes ahead and builds an altar according to the model of the Assyrian worship. Now, remember that this is an altar that is going to be carved with pagan imagery, honoring the Assyrian gods, not Yahweh. When Ahaz arrives home in Jerusalem from his trip to Damascus, he replaces the altar to the Lord. He actually puts the altar to the Assyrian gods in the place of the altar to the Lord and moves that out to the side. He changes kind of the array of the temple and sends further tribute out of the temple treasures to the king of Assyria. Okay, so that's all basically the story of King Ahaz that you can find in 2 Kings 16. So here's my first table talk question for you: is having heard this account of King Ahaz and Uriah the priest, how do you think that they behaved according to this story? Not a lot of good happening there from King Ahaz and from Uriah the priest. Okay, so I want to look at the same story as it gets related in Isaiah and in his writing, because Isaiah is actually one of the prophets who goes and he talks to King Ahaz. And you can read about this prophecy kind of from chapters 7 and for a few chapters, but we're going to look at chapters 7 and 8 particularly, which is two kind of separate prophecies. So we'll talk through these things. So Isaiah chapter 7, and I'm reading from the CSB again today. This took place during the reign of Ahaz, son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah. Aram's king, Rezin, and Israel's king, Pekah, son of Remaliah, went to fight against Jerusalem, but they were not able to conquer it. When it became known to the house of David that Aram had occupied Ephraim, so remember Ephraim is another name for Israel, so the northern kingdom is also called Ephraim. And the house of David is, of course, Ahaz's house. That's the kings of Judah. When it became known to the house of David that Aram had occupied Ephraim, the heart of Ahaz and the hearts of his people trembled like trees of a forest, shaking in the wind. The Lord said to Isaiah, "Go out with your son, Shear-Jashub." Now that's a name that means a remnant will return. To meet Ahaz at the end of the conduit of the upper pool, by the road to the launderer's field. Say to him, "Calm down and be quiet. Don't be afraid or cowardly because of these two smoldering sticks, the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and the son of Remaliah. For Aram, along with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah, has plotted harm against you. They say, 'Let's go up against Judah, terrorize it, and conquer it for ourselves. Then we can install Tabeel's son as king in it.' This is what the Lord God says. It will not happen. It will not occur. The chief city of Aram is Damascus. The chief of Damascus is Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be too shattered to be a people. The chief city of Ephraim is Samaria, and the chief of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you do not stand firm in your faith, then you will not stand at all." So basically, Isaiah is saying to Ahaz, remember who you are. You are the son of David, and you are in charge of Jerusalem. This is what the Lord is declaring. And then the Lord spoke again to Ahaz. "Ask for a sign from the Lord your God. It can be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven." But Ahaz replied, "I will not ask. I will not test the Lord." Isaiah said, "Listen, house of David, is it not enough for you to try the patience of men? Will you also try the patience of my God? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. See, the virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel. By the time he learns to reject what is bad and choose what is good, he will be eating curds and honey. For before the boy knows how to reject what is bad and choose what is good, the land of the two kings you dread will be abandoned. The Lord will bring on you, your people, and your father's house such a time as has never been since Ephraim separated from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria. On that day, the Lord will whistle to flies at the farthest streams of the Nile, and to bees in the land of Assyria. All of them will come and settle in the steep ravines, in the clefts of the rocks, in all the thorn bushes, and in all the water holes. On that day the Lord will use a razor hired from beyond the Euphrates River, the king of Assyria, to shave the hair on your heads, the hair on your legs, even your beards. On that day a man will raise a young cow and 2 sheep, and from the abundant milk they give he will eat curds. For every survivor in the land will eat curds and honey, and on that day every place where there were 1,000 vines worth 1,000 pieces of silver will become thorns and briars. A man will go there with bow and arrows, because the whole land will be thorns and briars. You will not go to all the hills that were once tilled with a hoe for fear of the thorns and briars. Those hills will be places for oxen to graze and for sheep to trample. So the Lord is promising judgment on both Israel and Aram, but he's also saying the raids are going to be coming on Judah, and a remnant will be remaining. This is Isaiah's son's name being used as a prophecy here. But he's also giving this promise that people will, like the remnant who is there, will be able to survive, but the land will not be cultivated anymore. It's going to be a broken place, infested by flies and bees, apparently. So let's read through chapter 8 and see kind of what Isaiah also ends up saying as this judgment to the house of Judah. And then the Lord said to me, take a large piece of parchment and write on it with an ordinary pen, Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. That's a name that means hurrying to the spoil or speeding to the plunder. I have appointed trustworthy witnesses, the priest Uriah and Zechariah, son of Jeberechiah. I was then intimate with the prophetess, that's Isaiah's wife, he calls her the prophetess throughout the book. And she conceived and gave birth to a son. The Lord said to me, name him Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. For before the boy knows how to call father or mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoils of Samaria will be carried off to the king of Assyria. So now the prophecy is more specifically pointed at those northern kingdoms. The Lord spoke to me again, because these people rejected the slowly flowing water of Shiloah and rejoiced with Rezin and the son of Remaliah, the Lord will certainly bring against them the mighty rushing water of the Euphrates River, the king of Assyria in all his glory. It will overflow its channels and spill over all its banks. It will pour into Judah, flood over it, and sweep through, reaching up to the neck. And its flooded banks will fill your entire land, Emmanuel. Band together, peoples, and be broken. Pay attention, all you distant lands. Prepare for war and be broken. Prepare for war and be broken. Devise a plan. It will fail. Make a prediction. It will not happen. For God is with us. For this is what the Lord said to me with great power, to keep me from going the way of this people. Do not call everything a conspiracy that these people say is a conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear. Do not be terrified. And I want you to pay attention to verses 13 and 14 here, because this is really the center of the message that Isaiah is giving to the people of Israel. And it's why Isaiah finds himself kind of marginalized against these institutions, king and priesthood, that he's kind of passing judgment on at this point. Here's what Isaiah says. You are to regard only the Lord of armies as holy. Only he should be feared. Only he should be held in awe. He will be a sanctuary, but for the two houses of Israel, he will be a stone to stumble over, and a rock to trip over, and a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Many will stumble over these. They will fall and be broken. They will be snared and captured. Bind up the testimony. Seal up the instruction among my disciples. I will wait for the Lord, who's hiding his face from the house of Jacob. I will wait for him. Here I am with the children the Lord has given me to be signs and wonders in Israel from the Lord of armies who dwells on Mount Zion. When they say to you, inquire of the mediums and the spiritists who chirp and mutter, shouldn't a people inquire of their God? Should they inquire of the dead on behalf of the living? Go to God's instruction and testimony. If they do not speak according to this word, there will be no dawn for them. They will wander through the land, dejected and hungry. When they are famished, they will become enraged, and looking upward will curse their king and their God. They will look toward the earth and see only distress, darkness, and the gloom of affliction, and they will be driven into thick darkness. Once again, a cheery message from Isaiah. So last week I talked about the threefold message of the prophetic writings that follow this accusation, call to repentance, and then judgment pattern. We also talked about how there's implicit in this message a twofold promise in the judgment portion. Either you're on the right side or the wrong side of judgment, right? And we looked at how Isaiah personally responded properly to God's call to repentance in his famous vision of God's throne room in Isaiah 6. God also warns Isaiah that his message is going to be largely falling on deaf ears when he goes to say it, and this one does. Ahaz never repents of his evil deeds, and it is up to his son Hezekiah, who ends up actually becoming quite a successful king, and Hezekiah ends up consulting with Isaiah again. We'll look at that next week, actually. One of the reasons why the prophets are able to speak messages of judgment, this pretty harsh message, I don't know if you got that from our reading of them today, but why are they able to speak these harsh messages of judgment? Well, it's because they choose to operate outside of the institutions at the center of Israel's public life, those being the monarchy and the temple, right, the priesthood. Israel had that defined priestly tribe, the Levites, who were supposed to minister at the temple, and they also had that defined specific family from the tribe of Judah that was supposed to be the monarchical family, the royal family, this line of David and Solomon. But we saw from the kind of the description, Ahaz looks to the Assyrian gods for his kind of stability, and Uriah, the priest, is willing to go along with it. These priests and royal families are a lot sketchier than they should be on whether they're actually going to follow the law and live into that covenant relationship with God that they're supposed to live into. Now, for a little bit of context about who Isaiah is, we don't entirely know. Aside from that, he's this son of Amoz. Isaiah's name means the Lord delivers, and you'll actually see this in his writings. We saw it today, that he takes his name seriously, the Lord delivers, and then he also names his sons with this like object lesson in mind for the kings of Israel. So there is some speculation and good reason to believe that Isaiah is a minor royal relative, like cousin maybe, or something like that, or a part of a noble family who's kind of like in, not too far into the outer circles. As this would kind of explain why he's able to even gain access to the king, as we read about in Isaiah chapter 7. But whatever the exact circumstances are, Isaiah is likely of the upper class. He's kind of educated. But because of this prophetic calling that God puts on his life, he ends up doing some pretty wild things as an individual that set him kind of outside of the bounds of polite society. One of these, which we read about today, and it's a pattern that's actually repeated by some of the later prophets as well, is that Isaiah's sons get named these kind of strange names that are acting as pointy object lessons to the people of Israel. Another instance that you can go and read about is found in chapter 20 of Isaiah, where Judah, Israel's gone by this time. Judah is under kind of continued raid from Assyria, and they're under threat from Assyria. So they send some diplomats down to Egypt, and they're trying to cozy up to Egypt and Cush to make Assyria back off. And what ends up happening is Isaiah gets this word from the Lord to go around naked for 3 years as a sign and an omen against Cush and Egypt. Those who made Cush their hope and Egypt their boast will be dismayed and ashamed. That you can find that in Isaiah chapter 20. That's very strange behavior indeed. But we're going to need to remember that a true prophet is not going to be beholden to acting in accord with kind of the polite rules of society. We saw this in those key central verses of chapter 8, 13 and 14. You are to regard only the Lord of armies as holy. Only he should be feared. Only he should be held in awe. He will be a sanctuary, but for the two houses of Israel, he'll be a stone to stumble over. The true prophet can't ultimately be loyal to any of the institutions in his society. Whatever occupies the center of his society, that can't hold his ultimate loyalty. Rather, what the true prophet's loyalty is going to be is to first principles, to living a life of faith in the holy God. The call that the prophet responds to is radical because they can see it clearly that if they do not make the Lord their sanctuary, then the Lord becomes a stumbling block. Now for the prophets, though, this ends up causing a bit of unease in terms of how they operate because by not being loyal to the center of society, they often find themselves kind of pushed out to the margins and they end up operating kind of awkwardly within the framework of the nation overall. I think an interesting instance where you see this is in David's life, where his sin against Uriah, the Hittite soldier of his, and Bathsheba, Uriah's wife, causes God's mouthpiece Nathan, this prophet, to come and speak against the evil behavior of David. But because King David was sensitive to Nathan's criticism, it's because David really wanted to be in right relationship with God. And so what ends up happening is not that the prophet gets kind of pushed off to the side, but Nathan ends up kind of centered as a courtier within David's kingdom. He's not right at the center, but Nathan becomes one of the kind of key advisors to King David. Nathan isn't asked to compromise his message, but he's able to call the institution to move over towards where Nathan knows that God wants them to be. He's able to get the ear of the sensitive king and hold him to account. And I think that looks something like the ideal way for institutions to interact with prophetic words from the Lord. However, when you get to some of the later prophets' lives, like Elijah, there are large portions of his story where he's living on the run and he's kind of having to do some weird things outside of what's normal. He's on the run, he lives in a cave for a time. At one point, he's relying on birds to show up to feed him, ravens. The Lord seems to work in mysterious ways. Likewise, when you get to his protege, his successor, Elisha ends up actually having to live outside of the land of Israel for a number of years. living with a widow who's kind of feeding him and putting up with him. And there's a whole miraculous story around that too, of course. But it's because the power centers in society, the temple, the priesthood, and the secular authorities, the king, they were not abiding by the Lord's covenant rules. Same when you get to John the Baptist. He doesn't fit in either the political or the religious establishment of the day, because he's saying harsh truths about Herod and Herod's court, the Edomite pretender king to the throne of Judea. He's a Roman puppet, basically, is what Herod is. Or the religious establishment, that's the group, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. John doesn't fit in with them either. Instead, he ends up having to position himself outside of society to make his aggressive and uncompromising call for repentance. So before I give you a little bit more of my thinking about why the prophets seem to do this, I want you to take a moment to think about this question. What benefits are there to finding yourself out at the margin of something? Or maybe what problems arise from being out at the margin? This theme of margin and center is one that I've really been interested in for the last year and a half or so. I've been kind of paying attention to it, largely because I've been paying attention to Jonathan Pageau's discussion of this concept through his Symbolic World podcast and some of the other media that he's putting out. One of his points is that in our times, we've fetishized the margins and tried to put them into the center of our institutions and of our society. And this is one of the reasons why our institutions have fallen into such decay. Now, you can pick out all kinds of different examples, but the one that I want to point out is the way that our culture has seemed to aim to center the mindset and philosophy of the entertainer. And I'm thinking especially of like artists or musicians or comedians who are being asked to weigh in on like topics of political importance or economic importance, or like how should society work, and it's like, well, ask the musicians. That's a terrible idea. Most musicians are not really clear thinkers. I would know, I'm one, about how societies ought to work necessarily, right? It's a very odd thing to do. The work of an artist or a musician or a comedian or someone like this is a recreative work, right? It's kind of a destructive thing. You sit outside of what normal society is to look at the world differently, and then you're able to speak about the truth from this alternative kind of perspective, and that's why you're able to make music, or it's why you're able to tell a joke about it, or why you end up painting paintings, is because you're trying to express things that are intuited or perceived more than like reasoned through. It's this very different way of approaching reality. And it's not that it's a bad way to approach reality. We need people who will do the work of art or the work of music or the work of even joke telling, right? But it's good for them to be able to sit on the outside and be able to look into society rather than to say, no, you people on the outside, you should be at the middle of society and you have the best ideas. I'm sure they don't most of the time, right? So this is one of the areas that he points out. You can kind of extrapolate from there and think about some of the other examples of where we've seen marginal activities or behaviors kind of centered in our society. Now, there's a whole bunch of different symbols that we can point to or examine to think about how this really ought to work, though. And one of the really interesting images that it expresses this is found in the architecture of older churches, especially like Catholic and Orthodox churches. And it's this idea of incorporating a gargoyle onto the outside of the building. So that's something that's always been a real mystery to me. Why on earth are these weird, monstrous winged things, demonic looking almost even, why are they on the outside of a church building? What's going on with that? Well, it never made sense to me until I heard Pageau kind of describe this as a description of the redemption and incorporation of the marginal and the monstrous into a true and a godly identity. We don't center those beings in a church architecture. When you go to the center of the church architecture, what you see is Jesus. And you see the altar, and you see the communion, this place where we partake in God's body and his life through, eating the symbols, right? Or if you get into the Reformation time period, you get the scriptures themselves get centered in the church architecture. Now, as an identity needs more mediation between God as the fount of all identity, the definer of all things, and then the subject, you kind of see these radial groupings, or maybe you could call it descent or filtering or hierarchy, right? So here's the example of how you would see that is at the center you have Jesus, but then just outside the center you have this kind of next radial group where you get like Mary and the disciples and stuff like that. Maybe you'll see things like the gospel writers being used as corner pillars and symbolism around that. As then you get further out in some of the churches, you'll see other biblical characters or apocryphal characters or later saints who are still pointing to and orienting the churchgoer towards Christ. And you can think of something like, well, I was thinking of like how in Berlin at the big Lutheran Domer Church, you'll see David is represented up with the organ and with all the musical implements, right? Of course, because we don't center David, David is a pointer to Christ, and he uses music to do that. And so, I mean, it makes sense, right? Like the physical reality of the church is supposed to be embodying like kind of the purpose of these different people for us. Sometimes in some of these churches, you'll actually even find like pagan or Jewish or like pre-Christian maybe philosophers or poets like a Plato or a Virgil or a Maimonides who are depicted in the outer parts of the building, not in the sanctuary because they're not part of the communion of God's people necessarily, but they are agents who are still pointing towards Christ, whether wittingly or not. And it's the same rationale as Dante has for using Virgil as his guide through the first 2/3 of the Divine Comedy in Purgatory and in Inferno. Virgil actually leads Dante through these parts of the thing because Virgil was a pre-Christian Roman poet who many of the early Christians saw as actually having some prophetic role in pointing towards Christ. And then as you get to the outer edges of the building, you see these weird monsters who are arrayed, these gargoyles, right, as a bulwark or a defense against the forces of darkness, right? It's this way of converting and redeeming and turning the monstrous to the good, right? To being used for the good. So there's a right way to incorporate all these different aspects of identity, but they need to be positioned kind of correctly. And that makes sense in terms of the church architecture, in terms of that thing, but it makes sense in terms of our lives too, right? We have to center, we be centered around Christ and the work that Christ is doing in us, and kind of our identity flows out of that. And he can incorporate and redeem all kinds of stuff from our life, even stuff that we would maybe even prefer to marginalize. But if we try to center the edge cases, what we're going to be left with is monsters in the middle, and identity will lose its cohesion. So why do the prophets end up going out to the margin? Well, Christianity is uniquely positioned to give an answer to this, and it's because the God that we worship is a God who transcends our categories. As soon as we think we've got God pinned down, he shows up in ways that will surprise us and make us rethink what we know. And we looked at Psalm 85 last week, and we saw how the psalmist identified God as bringing together righteousness, moral clarity, with peace. Moral clarity on its own can be a pretty violent experience, but peace on its own isn't necessarily going to be the right thing all the time. Sometimes there needs to be conflict, but God doesn't just like do one or the other. He brings them together. Think about John 1, where John talks about Jesus as being full of both grace and truth. It's not that he's either one of these things, because he's too soft if he's all grace, and he's too sharp or too hot if he's all truth, but that he is both of these things maximally. Jesus brings things together in himself, and this has always been the ultimate project of God. Here's how Paul describes Jesus' incarnation and his centrality and the way that he brings together the high and the low, the marginal and the middle in himself, in the work and death and the resurrection of Jesus. So this is from Colossians, and it's verses 15 to 20 of the first chapter. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation, for everything was created by him, in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He's before all things, and by him all things hold together. He's also the head of the body, the church. He's the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile everything to himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Now, a church, or the church, maybe capital T, capital C, is supposed to be able to incorporate all of this correctly and help each one to find their place, uniting in the body as the royal priesthood, as the holy nation. But I think what we do end up finding is, in practice, we still have the need for people who can do the unpleasant thing and sit outside of the institutions and call for repentance and corrective behavior. In our secular society, we certainly see the need for the church to be able to sit outside the halls of power and call people back to correct behavior, call the people who are occupying the places in our institutions back to correct behavior, back to regard for the truth, back to virtue, back to morality. Really what I'm describing is that the church's role in society at large is supposed to be prophetic. It's supposed to sit outside of the center of the institutions and call the institutions back towards itself. When we see the church co-opted and moving into those centers, when we see the church getting subsumed into political or business or cultural motivations, whether it becomes a funding issue or a promise of power or promises of popularity, what we end up seeing is the almost immediate failure of the church to behave into that prophetic covenant purpose. Now, this isn't to say that Christians shouldn't be or cannot be engaged in building institutions. Rather, I'm saying all of this to point out the danger of trusting in institutions. We so often make these institutions that we build our little gods because we naturally want to commit to things. We want to believe in things. We want to make something ultimate. But anything less than God is going to become an idol if we do this. I've seen many Christians who do this, making marriage or charity or their particular expression of the church or even their particular interpretation of the Bible, their God. And when you see this happening, what you see is idolatry is taking root. The prophetic role then has always had this function of refocusing and calling us back to core identity issues. Sometimes the reason that the prophets look so far out of place in their societies is that they've had to take up a position out on the margins to be able to point back to the middle, like Isaiah in chapter 20, where he's going naked and he's sitting outside and he's getting attention, but he's saying, this is what's going to happen. What I'm doing to myself willingly is what's going to happen to all of you if you cannot fix your perspective and start trusting in God instead of trusting in Egypt, right? Sometimes the institutions themselves have strayed so far from what should be the core identity, from what should be their core purposes, that the prophetic act is to occupy the moral middle and call the institution back to itself. And we saw that with the example of Nathan calling David out on his sin, and David moves back towards Nathan. Always, though, what we have is a plumb line keeping us straight. God calls us to covenant faithfulness, which he fully exemplifies in his behavior towards us, most clearly in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Those ultimate actions of a real identity standing against all the broken and sinful institutions that would vie for our loyalty. So to close out then, I'm going to give you one more prophetic image from one of our modern day prophets, C.S. Lewis. In the second book of his space trilogy, Lewis has his narrator describing meeting an angelic being for the first time. So the angelic being is presenting itself as a pillar of light to the narrator. But the narrator notes that when he sees this pillar of light in the room that he's in, and I'm going to quote from this book, this is Paralandra, it was not at right angles to the floor. But as soon as I've said this, I hasten to add that this way of putting it is a later reconstruction. What one actually felt at the moment was that the column of light was vertical, but the floor was not horizontal. The whole room seemed to have heeled over as if it were on board ship. The impression, however, produced was that this creature had reference to some horizontal, to some whole system of directions, based outside of the earth, and that its mere presence imposed that alien system on me and abolished the terrestrial horizontal. When we really experience God, when we really start paying attention to him, what we should notice is that our orientation is getting adjusted. We start lining up with the virtues and the values that we were always supposed to But that might well mean that we get pushed out to the margins of the institutions in which we have to operate. Because in a world as broken and twisted as ours, we might need to be marching to a different beat or towing a different line. So here's the table talk to finish up. Is it more important to do what's right than to fit in? And are you comfortable going against the grain at work with your friend and your family groups? Okay, take a bit of time to talk about that and pray with each other, and we'll see you next week.